Do not let your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. Today we are going into the deep end, going into the mystery, going into the uncomfortable uncertainty. We are going to go in way over our heads. And when I talk about the deep end, I don't mean the deep end of the pool where you can see the bottom and you're perhaps only a few inches from the surface. I'm talking about the deep, dark mysteries and the uncertainties of the universe that we live in. We're going to be in way over our heads today. But it started last week. Last week, we began a conversation about the largest recorded teaching of Jesus in the entire Bible. It's not the Sermon on the Mount. It is what is called the Upper Room Discourse. It takes place in the final hours of Jesus' life, and it is contained in 5 chapters in the book of John, John 13 through 17. It is the last words of Jesus before he went to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, and then was arrested, tortured, crucified, and buried. And these are the things that he said, and what we are doing between now and the celebration of the resurrection on Easter is we are examining the paradoxes in Jesus' teaching, the mysteries, the things that make us uncomfortable in Jesus' teaching there in the upper room. And these paradoxes are not intimidating, they're not complicated, they're just unsettling. And they're unsettling for us for a number of reasons. I like to think that one of the reasons that the paradoxes and the mysteries of the universe are uncomfortable for us is because we are children of the Enlightenment. We are people who are empirical in our nature. We are taught from the time that we begin to learn that truth is discovered through the scientific method. It is discovered by examination, by testing, by proving, by having results that we can say, this is true because I can prove it. But we live in a world of paradoxes, and a paradox means that it's something that we cannot prove, but it is true. We also cannot disprove it. And a paradox says it's not an either-or equation that we're working with, it's a both-and. And this makes us uncomfortable. We are intimidated, even in some degree terrified of the mystery. And today we are going into the abyss. We are going to talk about the paradox of the already and the not yet, the mystery of time and space, the limitations of human consciousness, what is beyond our human experience, specifically what happens when we die. And I want us to wrestle with the question today, is heaven real? But as any good diver will tell you, we should probably take a few deep breaths before we descend. So I would invite you to take a breath and pray with me. Would you join me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word, spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit, to challenge us and to comfort us with the hope of heaven. Pray that for myself, for my family, for everyone who is watching online, and everyone who's here today. Pray that you will remind us of that hope. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. So there's a story about a priest who died and went to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he gets there, and there's the pearly gates, and there's St. Peter welcoming him in. He says, welcome to heaven, welcome home, my brother. You are going to be so excited to see what we have in heaven, particularly you, as a priest who was who was absorbed in the study of the history of the church and the liturgies and all of the details of the faith. And I'm going to tell you that we have here in heaven an archive. And it's an archive where we have recorded every prayer that every priest has ever prayed, and everything that every pope has ever said, every message that has been delivered in a mass throughout history. We have an archive. It will take you forever to get through it, but you've got the time. And so the priest was overjoyed. He says, take me to this archive. And he goes to the archive and he's overwhelmed. He says, I want to go right back to the beginning. I want to go to the first prayers and the first words, and I want to start there. So Peter points him to the archive and he goes in. Sometime later, Peter is walking by the archive and he hears the priest crying out. It's an R. It's an R. It's an R. Peter makes his way through the archive and he finds him in a carrel down in the oldest of manuscripts. And he looks at the priest and he says, what's the problem? He said, it says celebrate. Really? I thought we had more Catholics in this church. But we do that, don't we? And they're not that funny. We tell jokes about heaven. I mean, there's thousands of them. And some of them are as ridiculous as that one. And we don't know what to do with it. So we have sort of a coping mechanism. We treat it lightly. We treat it theoretically. We treat heaven as a fantasy. We can't really comprehend what it is. We can't really agree on what it is. We can't understand it. So we either ignore it or we make fun of it or we disregard it. But I would suggest to you that even though it makes us uncomfortable, even though we don't want to deal with the idea of what happens when we die, what happens in our life beyond this life, it is a question worth asking, because the way you answer that question changes everything. If you say no, there's no heaven. It's understandable, especially for those of us who are skeptical and cynical and curious and we want tangible evidence. We want to understand things. Heaven is beyond our understanding. And so rather than try to sound fictitious, try to sound like we're telling a fairy tale, we just put it on the shelf and we say, no, I don't understand it. That means it must not be true. I understand that. I understand the difficulty of it. It was in October of 1971 that John Lennon, one of the Beatles, released a solo album. And the solo album is titled by the title track. It carries the title, Imagine. And the song Imagine, in the 50 plus years that it has been in public, has become an anthem of sorts. It has become a calling cry. You could call it a hymn of postmodernism. It is a beautiful melody that's haunting and memorable. As soon as you hear it, you remember it. But it is an anthem. It is a hymn that makes its message plain in the first line. The first line of Imagine, Lennon says, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. The chorus says, you may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. I understand the sentiment. I understand what Lennon is reacting to. Down through the centuries, down throughout human history, particularly in the post-Christian age or in the age post-resurrection, Christianity has been weaponized. Christian exceptionalism has created an antagonism and an antipathy between peoples. Wars have been started over religious beliefs. They are fought to this day because of weaponized religious beliefs. And I understand how John Lennon was looking at the world and saying, I can't prove that there's a heaven, but I see the corruption and the toxicity that the religion and these ideas about what heaven is create. And I want to speak against that because it doesn't seem to be working. So maybe if we imagine there is no heaven, that will work. Problem is there is no proof of that concept. There's no proof that if you eliminate the accountability, the consequences, the hope of heaven from human existence, that people will naturally be drawn together, that they will set aside their differences and, as he sang, be as one. It was in 1883 that Friedrich Nietzsche began to observe in the culture the decline of conventional morality and traditional ethics. And he wrote a series of pamphlets called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it's in there that Nietzsche's most famous phrase, God is dead, is found. And most people think that this is a proclamation, that what Nietzsche was saying is that God is in fact dead, but he wasn't saying it as a proclamation, he was saying it as a prophecy. If you read what Nietzsche was saying, he was saying, I foresee a world where there is no God, where there is no heaven, where there are no consequences, where there is a subjective morality, and what I see is not unity, but tragedy and calamity and catastrophe. Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900, right on the event horizon of the 20th century. And the 20th century would, in fact, go on to be as Nietzsche predicted it, that because God had died, more people died in war or in genocide or in democide in the 20th century than had ever died before in human history. It is possible, the calculations are uncertain, to say that just two men, Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, were personally responsible for the genocide or for the elimination through war or through democide, through famine and starvation, the deaths of between 200 and 230 million people. Because what happens if there's no heaven, and this is the challenge of no heaven, the challenge is, what value does a human being have? If you have no intrinsic value beyond this life, you're just a bag of chemicals walking around. And I think this is what Jesus meant in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, if you call your brother or your sister a fool, you are guilty of murder. Because he was foretelling that if you devalue human beings, they have no eternal or theistic value. They're simply utilitarian, disposable, biological beings. If you look at human beings like that, you will call them a fool. You will disregard them and marginalize them. And what that will lead to is murder. Because you have devalued them to the point where their only value is your use. And if you challenge yourself to say, if there's no heaven, then what's the point? What's the point of kindness? What's the point of generosity? What's the point of philanthropy? What's the point of forgiveness? What's the point of grace? Only if it serves me. It's very Darwinian. If you eliminate the theistic view of the value of the image of God in people, you begin to realize the only value people have is how they serve me, how they benefit me. It's pure Darwinianism. It's not just survival of the fittest, it's survival of the most useful, survival of the most powerful, because that's where the value is. And so as much as we struggle to say, well, I can't get my mind around heaven, I can't believe that there is a heaven, when you eliminate the possibility of it entirely, It changes everything. But if you say yes, I believe in heaven, I believe that heaven is real, then that changes everything as well. But it poses a number of challenges. The first challenge is the challenge of, what does that mean? Does it mean fat little babies on clouds with little harps? Does it mean golden pearly gates where priests walk in and archives of every prayer that was ever prayed? Is it streets of gold? Is it unicorns and woolly mammoths and things that have gone extinct? What is the sensory reality of heaven? What is it really all about? And if you have any kind of imagination at all, you just have a free pass to imagine that heaven is the best day of your life. It is the greatest fulfillment of your dreams. It is a staggering pleasure palace that goes on forever. And that imagination has stirred authors and writers and poets and musicians and composers and filmmakers. In 1997, there was a film that Robert Zemeckis made called Contact. It's based on a book by Carl Sagan where they explored the idea of what would happen if someone could break the time-space barrier and experience a reality beyond this reality. In 2014, there was another movie that wrestled with the same thing by Christopher Nolan called Interstellar. And they suggested that if you pass through a wormhole or a black hole, you could enter into a timeless existence where time was relative and things happened in real time in your experience, but out in the world they were moving at a much slower pace or a faster pace. And they're beautiful sets of imagination because we don't know. Have you ever heard of an NDE? There's a scientific term. It's called a near-death experience. And a near-death experience takes place when a person technically has died and has an experience after death, but then is revived and comes back to life and talks about that experience. Those NDEs are viewed as not actual death experiences. They're called near-death experiences, which reveals our skepticism of them. But when people study near-death experiences, they find remarkable similarities because it's not dozens of people who have had this experience. It's hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of people who have had the same experience. They've had experiences outside of their own body, watching the surgeons operate on them, and they can recall when they are revived the words that were said, the instruments that were used. They have stood above the accident scene where they were killed and described what the paramedics were wearing and the activities that were going on. They describe almost with 90 to 97% similarity the experiences outside of their body. Now, most neuroscientists look at this and say these are just random coincidences. These are the activities of a dying brain that is subjectively recalling and communicating in a way that a person remembers when they are revived, when they are restored to life. They recall these things. But the stories are too consistent to be ignored. But it's hardly consequential proof. Whether or not you say yes or no, there is a heaven, is because you believe, you choose to believe it. I believe that there is a heaven. And there's one reason why I believe this. It's because of a promise. A promise that was given to us from one who never broke a promise. From one who is as reliable as anyone who has ever lived. The promise is recorded for us in the Upper Room Discourse in John chapter 14. In John chapter 14, as Jesus was looking into the inevitable, his arrest and his torture and his crucifixion and his death, as he was looking forward to the next 24 hours of excruciating pain, denial, and betrayal, he said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. You think I would have told you that if I wasn't going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and I will bring you with me so that we can be together in that place. You know the way where I am going. And doubting Dave, the cynic Dave, the empiricist Dave says, no, I don't. Could you be more clear? What are these rooms? What are these rooms? What is this place? I don't understand what this place is. What do you mean you're going to go there and prepare it and then you're going to come back and we're going to be together? I don't understand what this means. Give me photographic evidence. Give me something that I can look at and something that I can understand. But it's like a person being born blind trying to understand purple. I can't. We don't have the vocabulary. We don't have the sensory experience to understand what exists beyond this dimension, what life is like beyond this life, because it is not limited by the experiences or the dimensions or the values that we have in this world. It has to be different, because the only way you get there is by dying. Fortunately, I'm not the only person that asks stupid questions. There was a guy in the room with Jesus named Thomas. We know him as Doubting Thomas. Think of him as Doubting Dave. And when Jesus says, you know the place where I'm going and you know the way there, Thomas says, whoa, whoa, whoa. How can we know the way when we don't even know where you're going? How do we know the way? And it's in verse 6 of John chapter 14. That Jesus lays out the hope of heaven, the promise. He says, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to that place, comes to the Father, except through me. Now, this statement has been twisted, and it's been tough to understand, because what does it mean when Jesus says, I am the way? Does that mean there's no other way? Does that mean someone who was born before Christ was born, or who was born in a nation that never heard the gospel, or a person who dies in infancy or dies as a child and can't comprehend what it means to believe in Jesus? What happens to those people? And what is the truth? What is the dimension beyond this life? What is eternity? What is infinite? What is the relationship of our human consciousness? What is the life? What is this that you're talking about? And how is it that no one comes to the Father except through you? Don't know. I know it's a question worth asking. But at some point you have to decide. I've heard of Jesus. I know this promise. Do I believe it or not? The analogy that I like to use, and I've used it here before, is an analogy of a train station. You ever been to Europe? Go to a train station in Europe. European train stations were built when everybody traveled by train. They were before airports, before highways. There were train stations. If you go to a grand European train station, you will find dozens and dozens of tracks. All of the trains arriving and leaving and going to specific destinations. And when you go in and you buy your ticket, you go onto the train platform, and then you look at the departure board and you find out where is the track the train is on that I want to get on. And then you take your ticket and you go and you get on the train and it takes you to where you want to go. Well, life is like that. We are born onto the train platform. And in front of us are train tracks, are departure guides. There's a guide to heading for nirvana, or heading for reincarnation, or heading for oblivion, or heading for annihilation, or heading for a life with 7 virgins, or heading for some kind of glorious, pleasure-filled existence on a tropical island. And all of these options are in front of us. And there's one train that says, I'm going to heaven, and Jesus is the conductor, and I promise I will get you there. And so here we are on the station platform, and you have all of these choices in front of you, and you can prove none of them. But you have a promise. I can't tell you what oblivion is, or annihilation is, or nirvana is, or what the tropical paradise is, but I can tell you who said, I will take you to be with me. And I want that ticket punched. Now, the other challenge of this is, so what? You got to ask yourself the question, why don't I get on that train right now? Have you seen the world that we live in? It's a mess. I mean, the struggle every day. They took an hour from us. What happened to that hour? Where'd they put it? I want my hour back. If they can take us an hour, can't they just give us an hour? Can't they give us more hours? Who does these things? What is this messed up world that we live in? If I have the hope of heaven, I want to get on that train today. I am done. But you have a purpose on the platform, you see. We have a purpose on the platform, not just to invite people to say, you should get on this train with us, but to manifest the reality of it to everyone that we meet, because everyone that we meet has that eternal value. They are made in the image of God, and we are here to serve them and show them grace. And every day that I am on the platform is another opportunity for me to manifest the expectation and the anticipation of heaven. You can say yes or no, but each of them has consequences. It's uncomfortable for us to think about the reality of the challenges of saying, no, there is no heaven, or yes, there is, but they have consequences. It is a question worth asking. And it makes us uncomfortable, because in that discomfort, we have to understand that it changes everything about us, whether we realize it or not. That's why we treat it so lightly. That's why we tell jokes about it. That's why we create fictional stories and songs. It's like the joke about the three friends and their three buddies who have grown up together. They've known each other for their entire lives, since they were children. And now they're in the last chapter of their lives. They're all in their 80s, and every week they meet at their favorite pub, and they have a pint together, and they sit at the bar, and they tell stories. They actually lie to each other. And the three of them are sitting there, and they're telling the stories about what do you think happens when we die? And one of the folks says, hey, what do you think people will say at your wake when they're looking at your body in the coffin? And the one guy says, well, I hope they say I was a good man. And the other guy says, I hope they say I was a good friend. And the other man says, I hope they say, look, he's moving. A number of years ago, Diane and I were snorkeling. And I do lazy man, old guy snorkeling. Don't think I'm doing these deep free dives and all this exotic, petting whales stuff. No, I'm just in the Caribbean, and I got my pool floaty. Those styrofoam things, like a pool noodle? And you put it under your arms, and you just kind of float, and you stick your head in the water. And if you're in the Caribbean, the water's like crystal clear. It's like flying. And you just kind of float around. It's lazy man snorkeling. And we were in this one place, and they said, if you go out about 100 yards, the reef ends, and there's a trench. And the trench is over 2,000 feet deep. And it falls off, it's a vertical cliff. And so Dave says, I got to see this. So I kind of float my way out there. And I remember to this day how I felt. I got to the edge, right to the edge of that reef. And then it went black. There was nothing. And I was terrified. It was physically terrifying for me to swim out over this blackness. which didn't make any sense at all because I have my floaty. And I can swim 5 feet back or 10 feet back to the reef, and the reef is only 8 feet under the water. I wasn't going to drown, but it was the uncertainty, it was the unknown that terrified me. It was the mystery, the darkness. That's why it's hard for us. Because we don't like the mystery, we don't like the uncertainty. Which is why I believe in heaven, not because of the data, not because of the evidence, but because of the promise of the one who said, don't be afraid. You believe in God, believe also in me.